Friends, hello. Do you think you've seen and heard it all? Think again. Today, we dive into the world of the incredible. 30 stories that are simply impossible to believe. Some of these tales are so unbelievable that they seem made up, but it's all pure truth. 30 cases that almost no one knows about and that could turn your perception of reality upside down. Today, you will learn how two scientists accidentally heard the echo of the Big Bang while trying to clean pigeon droppings, how an Englishman bought Stonehenge as a gift for his wife and she nearly kicked him out of the house for it, and how an entire village built a giant mirror on a mountain to steal the sun from winter. Following our good tradition, before we start, please like and comment. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's get started. Story number 1. Two guys, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, and the echo of creation. Imagine New Jersey in the mid-60s. Two young radio astronomers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, stand in the middle of a field looking at a gigantic, ridiculous structure resembling a huge hearing horn. This is the Holmdel horn antenna, and the guys have a problem. A very annoying problem. They are trying to listen to space. Their goal is to capture radio waves reflected from balloon satellites to improve telephone communication. But every time they put on their headphones and adjust the equipment, they hear a hissing sound, a monotonous, nagging, maddening static noise. It was everywhere, day and night, winter and summer. No matter where they pointed their giant horn, whether at New York or into the void of space, the hiss was right there. Penzias and Wilson were perfectionists. They decided that it must be interference. They checked everything. They suspected the noise was coming from New York. Too many people, too much radio, too much hustle and bustle. They turned the antenna. The noise remained. Maybe it was radiation from nuclear test sites? No. Then they looked inside the antenna and found a pair of pigeons, ordinary mourning doves, who decided that this scientific device was the perfect nesting spot. And, as is typical for pigeons, they covered the inner surface of the antenna, let's say, with a white dielectric material. Well, you get the idea. The scientists sighed, grabbed brooms and dustpans, and got to work cleaning. Picture this scene. Future Nobel Prize winners on their knees scrubbing pigeon droppings so that science could move forward. They caught the pigeons, took them far away, and released them. They cleaned every inch, checked every cable, even taped the joints with aluminum tape, and turned on the equipment. Silence? No, the hiss, the same sound. They were in despair. They had ruled everything out. Pigeons, the city, passing airplanes, faulty wires. There was only one explanation left, which turned out to be impossible. The noise was not coming from the antenna, or from the ground. It was coming from everywhere at once. Completely by chance, at the nearby Princeton University, another group of physicists was theoretically predicting that if the universe had indeed been born from the Big Bang, then somewhere there should be an echo, thermal radiation that had cooled over billions of years. They searched for this echo for years, but they didn't have the right equipment. However, Penzias and Wilson did have the equipment, and without realizing it, they had been listening for several months to the breath of the newborn universe, mistaking it for pigeon droppings. In 1978, they received the Nobel Prize in Physics for this discovery. They proved that our world had a beginning, simply by trying to eliminate background noise. Sometimes, to hear eternity, you just need to grab a broom and clean up properly. Or maybe not? But that's a completely different story. By the way, friends, for the most curious, I have left links to all the original sources in the description. Check them out, and let's continue. Story number 2. The man who fooled death 7 times to gift us jazz. Do you consider yourself clumsy? You know, bumping your pinky toe against a table or breaking your favorite mug? It happens. But honestly, your clumsiness is merely child's play compared to what this guy went through. If bookmakers existed in the 19th century, they wouldn't have accepted bets on whether this child would survive to see the age of 10. His name was Antoine Joseph, or as we know him, Adolphe Sax. Belgium, 1814. A son is born to a master of musical instruments, and from the very first days, the universe seems determined to test his resilience. Seriously, It's like a script from a bad dark comedy. Barely learning to walk, little Adolf falls from the third floor. Bam! Head first onto a stone. Everyone thought that was the end, but the boy just brushed himself off. Time goes by, and he, confusing some bottles, drinks a cup of vitriol and sulfuric acid. Acid. Anyone else in his situation would have ended their story there, but Adolf survived. Think that's all? Not at all. He swallowed a long pin. He was burned when gunpowder exploded. He fell onto a hot cast-iron skillet, suffering burns over half his body. A brick fell on him from a roof. He nearly poisoned himself 3 times with toxic fumes from his father's workshop. Once, he was found floating unconscious in a river after being swept away by the current. His own mother, witnessing this madness, sadly told the neighbors, "This child is a ghost. He is not meant to live." But Adolphe Sax was the most stubborn survivor in the history of Europe. It seemed that fate itself was trying to take him down, but each time, it just missed the mark at the last moment. And so, having survived all these calamities, a grown-up Adolf locked himself in his workshop. He wanted to create something new, something that would sound as powerful as brass, but as gentle as wood. He took the mouthpiece from a clarinet and attached it to a coffee canister. It was an old contraption. He bent metal, soldered, experimented, and created a monster. A strange curved tube that roared like a steamship and whispered like a love-struck saxophone. At first, it was hated. Musicians refused to play it, calling it a devil's horn. Sax had competitors. Yes, he had enemies who even tried to kill him. Apparently, the accidents weren't enough for them. They set fire to his factory and stole his blueprints. Sax went bankrupt twice. He lived in poverty. He even developed a tumor on his lip. Another greeting from fate, which, as it happens, was miraculously healed by some Indian doctor. But he didn't give up. He survived acid and falls from rooftops. What did critics matter to him? He lived to the age of 80, a man of catastrophe. He died in his bed, leaving the world an instrument without which no jazz club, no romantic ballad, and, ultimately, no Lisa Simpson could be imagined. So, when you're having a bad day and everything seems to fall apart, remember Adolf. Perhaps the universe is just preparing you to invent something great. Or maybe you just need to be more careful with acid. Story number 3. The Royal Cup of Poison and the Longest Experiment. Science is a serious matter. People in white coats, test tubes, complicated formulas, but honestly, it hasn't always been that way. Sometimes science looked like a stubborn teenager arguing with reality. One of the funniest examples of such an argument happened in Sweden at the end of the 16th century. King Gustav II was a categorical man with a fiery passion. He hated coffee, could not stand it at all. He was absolutely certain that this dark, bitter drink was a slow poison, turning good Swedes into nervous wrecks. He issued decrees, banned coffee pots, and taxed cups and saucers. But people, mischievously, continued to brew and drink. Underground coffee shops thrived. Then Augustus decided to take another route. He needed evidence, rock-solid scientific facts. Thus began the first clinical experiment in history to study the effects of caffeine. However, the methods were quite specific. The king found 2 identical twin brothers. Both were in prison for minor offenses and were awaiting a harsh sentence. Gustav made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Their lives would be spared, and they would live in comfort, but with one condition. They would become laboratory rats. The conditions were simple. The first brother had to drink an enormous amount of tea every day, just buckets full. The second brother was the guinea pig. He was required to drink coffee, lots of coffee, 3 huge pitchers a day. The king rubbed his hands, expecting the coffee brother to soon writhe in agony, turn green, and become a perfect example of the dangers of stimulating beverages. The brothers were attended by the 2 best doctors in the kingdom to record every sneeze and, most importantly, the moment the inevitable end arrived. And the experiment began. A year passed. The twins felt excellent. The tea brother was bored while the coffee brother was remarkably lively and energetic. 5 years went by. The doctors wrote reports. Pulse normal, good appetite. 10 years later, strange things began to happen. The first to pass away was one of the doctors due to old age. After a while, the second doctor followed him. The twins continued to drink their beverages and had probably gotten used to their strange diet. Then, let's say, King Gustav II left the project himself. The story is murky, but he didn't live to see the results. The experiment lost its sponsor, but it wasn't cancelled. The brothers simply continued their lives on inertia. In the end, the first participant in the experiment to pass away was the one who drank tea. He was 83 years old. For the 16th century, that's practically ancient. But what about our poisoned coffee lover? He outlived his brother, outlived the king, outlived all the doctors, and died a very old man without showing any signs of poisoning. The irony is that today, Sweden consistently ranks among the top 3 countries with the highest coffee consumption per capita in the world. Residents of Stockholm drink it in liters, unaware that they owe their beloved coffee break to 2 stubborn twins who just wanted to outlive the king. Sometimes, to prove your point, you just need to pour yourself another cup and wait. Story number 4. The day the ocean stole an entire continent and no one noticed. We are used to trusting maps. If the Earth is illustrated there, then it must be there. If there's a blue spot, it means water. This is the foundation of our understanding of the world. But what if I told you that once an entire island the size of Manhattan simply disappeared? And it's not a matter of magic. It stems from one of the most bizarre mistakes in the history of geography. Meet Sandy Island. It lay in the Coral Sea somewhere between Australia and New Caledonia, a beautiful, elongated piece of land about 25 kilometers long. Sandy Island had been on maps for over 100 years. It appeared in Times atlases, on navigation charts of the British Admiralty, and even on Google Earth, a black patch of pixels amid the blue abyss. Captains plotted their routes around it to avoid grounding. Fishermen steered clear of it. It was as real as London or your sofa. Then, in 2012, Australian scientists on the Sather survey ship ventured into the area. They weren't looking for adventure, they just wanted to study tectonic plates. While checking the navigator, the captain noticed something odd. The instruments indicated that at the location where Sandy Island was supposed to rise, the ocean's depth was 1,400 meters. Wait, 1.5 kilometers of water where land should be? The crew tensed up. Could the instruments be wrong? Or had the island sunk like Atlantis? They got closer, looking through binoculars. The horizon was clear. No palm trees, no sand, not even a small rock sticking out of the water. Just waves. They sailed right through the island. The echo sounders were silent. Sandy simply didn't exist. How could this happen? How could the entire world deceive itself for over a century? The scientists began to dig into the archives. It turned out that the island was first noted by the crew of the whaling ship Velocity in 1876. The captain recorded in the log that he saw heavy swells and sandy shoals. The cartographers, without much thought, marked the spot on the map just in case, to prevent anyone from running aground. Most likely, the whalers didn't see land at all, but a massive pumice stone, a floating volcanic rock that sometimes forms after underwater eruptions. This stone drifted, slowly sank, and disintegrated, while the island remained on paper. For 136 years, humanity diligently navigated around an empty space. Digital maps simply copied the old paper data, and satellites, seeing a dark spot on the water, perhaps the same pumice or a play of light, confirmed the error. Imagine the expression on the captain's face when he realizes he has been circling around a ghost for decades. In November 2012, Sandy Island was officially reclassified. It was erased from National Geographic's maps and removed from Google. This serves as a reminder to all of us. Sometimes what we consider solid ground beneath our feet is just an old mistake that no one bothered to check. And, to be honest, it's a little sad. The world has one less mysterious island. Story number 5. A grandmother who walked across all of America because she got bored. You know that feeling when you retire and don't know what to do with yourself? Some people knit socks, some dabble in gardening, some binge-watch series. But Emma Gatewood, whom everyone called Grandma Gatewood, stepped out on her porch one morning, adjusted her glasses, and decided to go for a walk. The catch was that she was 67 years old. She had 11 children, 23 grandchildren, and 30 great-grandchildren. Plus, she had arthritis and painful legs. And she decided to walk the Appalachian Trail. To give you an idea of the scale, that's 3,500 kilometers through wild forests, mountains, and rivers, from the state of Georgia to the state of Maine. Professional hikers prepare for this for years. They buy expensive backpacks, freeze-dried food, and special boots. Many young and healthy guys quit within a week, crying from blisters and exhaustion. Grandma Gatewood took a bag with her, a simple denim bag but she made herself. What was inside? A tent? A sleeping bag? A compass? No, she tossed in a blanket, a rain poncho, and a plastic shower curtain. For food, she packed some cheese, nuts, and jerky. On her feet, she wore basic sneakers. Sneakers, no trekking boots with ankle support. She didn't tell her children where she was going to avoid panic. She simply said she was going for a walk, and off she went. It was 1955. The forest was wild. There were more bears than people. Emma slept directly on the ground under piles of leaves when it got cold. She heated stones by the fire and kept them close. When the food ran out, she foraged for berries and sorrel. She knew the woods like the back of her hand. Once, she lost her glasses, and another time she broke one of the lenses, but she kept going. Locals who encountered her on the trail thought she was some kind of city crazy or homeless, but when they asked where she was going, she calmly replied, "To Maine." Journalists caught wind of her story when she was already halfway through. It became a sensation. All of America was watching the wandering grandmother. She was welcomed as a hero. People offered her food and shelter, but she mostly politely declined and continued on her way. After 146 days, she reached the end. She became the first woman to hike this trail solo in a single season, wearing sneakers. Do you think she stopped there? 2 years later, she hiked it again. And then at 75, she hiked it a third time. She did this simply because she loved the fresh air. When she was asked why she did it, she shrugged and said, "I thought it would be a nice adventure." Grandma Gatewood proved to the world that age is just a number in a passport, and real gear isn't Gore-Tex and titanium, but determination and comfortable sneakers. And if your grandmother says she went to the store for bread, it's best to clarify which state that store is in. Story number 6. A cowboy who stole a camel and became the ghost of Arizona. The Wild West. What do you envision? Horses, hats, revolvers, dust? Classic imagery. But the story I want to tell adds a Western element that is utterly out of place. Imagine a tough cowboy riding not on a Mustang, but on the humped ship of the desert. Yes, we're talking about camels in America. In the mid-19th century, the United States Army decided to conduct an experiment. Why do we need horses in the deserts of Texas and Arizona if they die of thirst? Let's bring in the creatures made for the sand, the generals thought, and they purchased several dozen camels from Africa and Turkey. They created a camel corps. The idea looked brilliant on paper, but turned out to be a disaster in practice. The camels drove the horses mad with fear, spat at the officers, and smelled so bad that soldiers fainted. When the Civil War began, the camels were simply forgotten. Some were sold to circuses, while others escaped into the desert. And this is where our hero enters the scene. A ghost, a legend. His name was the Red Ghost. In 1883, at the Lonely Ranch in Arizona, 2 women spotted a monster in the yard. It was huge, red, and on its back sat a devil. At least, that's what they told the sheriff. The creature trampled one of the women. Fortunately, she survived, but was scared to death and vanished. Then, reports started coming in from prospectors and cowboys. They all claimed to have seen a gigantic red beast racing through the canyons faster than the wind. But the most terrifying part was not the beast itself. On its back, there truly sat a rider. The dead skeleton of a man dangled on the creature's humps, tied with straps. His head bobbed from side to side. His hands and legs slapped against the sides of the animal as if urging it on in a hellish gallop. People were afraid to leave their homes. Newspapers wrote about the red ghost that was exacting vengeance on the living. Some shot at it, but the bullets seemed to have no effect on the monster. The resolution came only 10 years later. One farmer, rising early, saw that the giant camel, which, indeed, was a wild descendant of those army camels, was munching on his bushes in the garden. The farmer didn't think of the mystical. He took his rifle and, with a precise shot, brought the beast down. When people came closer, they saw the horrifying truth. There were indeed human remains on the back of the animal. The rawhide straps had dug into the camel's flesh, having become embedded over the years. Who was it? No one knows for sure, but the most popular theory suggests it was a young soldier who was afraid to ride. His comrades, as a joke, tied him to the tamest camel so he wouldn't fall. But the camel got scared, bolted, and took the young man into the endless desert where they both became part of one chilling legend. The red ghost stopped haunting Arizona, but they say that wild descendants of those army camels roamed the American deserts until the mid-20th century. So, if you're in Texas and see a strange silhouette on the horizon, take a closer look. Maybe it's not a mirage. Story number 7. The man who bought Stonehenge as a gift for his wife. And it was a bad idea. Imagine wanting to give your wife a present. Flowers are cliché. Jewelry is boring. A trip to Paris? Everyone does that. But Cecil Chapp, a wealthy British lawyer, thought big. In 1915, he went to an auction to buy his wife, let's say, a beautiful set of dining chairs. At least, that's what he told her. Instead, he came home not with chairs, but with documents proving ownership of Stonehenge. Yes, that very ancient monument, the mystery of the Druids, the giant stones in the middle of the Salisbury Plain. At the time, Stonehenge was not a national treasure. It was privately owned by the Antrobus family who owned the land around it. However, the last heir had died in the war, and the estate was set to be sold in parts. Lot number 15. Stonehenge with surrounding land. Cecil Chapp sat in the hall, sipping tea, and suddenly thought, why not? Mary loves antiques. The bidding was slow. No one really wanted to buy a bunch of old rocks, especially since they were in terrible condition. Some stones had fallen, others were propped up with wooden beams. Chapp raised his hand. 6,600 pounds in today's money is just under $1 million. And the gavel came down. Congratulations, sir! You are now the owner of Britain's greatest mystery. A happy Cecil rushed home. Darling, guess what I bought? It's not chairs, it's better. It's huge stones with a history of 5,000 years. Mary looked at him, let's say, without enthusiasm. Cecil, you idiot. That's about how her expression read. Why do we need a pile of rocks in the middle of a field? There isn't even a roof. Where will we hang the curtains? And I specifically asked for drapes for the living room. The gift did not go over well. Mary Chapp apparently was a practical woman and did not appreciate the romance of the Druids. Cecil owned Stonehenge for 3 years. He honestly tried to be a good owner, but it seems his wife's complaints about the useless pile of stones took their toll. In 1918, tired of family disputes, Cecil Chapp did something that Britain is still thankful for today. He simply donated Stonehenge to the state for free, with one condition. Local residents must have free access forever. And you know what? This condition is still upheld. If you live in the area, you can walk to the stones without paying a penny, thanks to the fact that 100 years ago, one lawyer really missed the mark with a gift for his wife. Cecil was given the title of baronet and went down in history as the man who gifted Stonehenge to the nation. And Mary? Well, I hope she eventually got those chairs. Story number 8. A meal that lasts longer than your life. Have you ever waited too long for your order in a restaurant? 20 minutes? An hour? It's frustrating, I know. But there is one musical piece in comparison that makes waiting in line at the post office seem like a moment. It's a concert that started before you were born and will probably end when your great-grandchildren have already retired. Welcome to the Church of St. Burchard in the German city of Halberstadt. Here, in this old building, there is an organ. Sandbags are tied to its keys, and it plays very slowly. This piece is called As Slow as Possible. The second part of the abbreviation stands for As Slow as Possible. It was composed by the avant-garde composer John Cage. In its original form, the piece lasts about 20 minutes, but fans of Cage, gathering in 2001, thought, John said as slowly as possible. How slowly can the organ play before the building itself falls apart? They calculated and decided to stretch the 20-minute piece over 639 years. The concert began on September 5, 2001. Do you know how it started? With a pause, with silence. For the first year and a half, the organ simply was silent. Visitors came, looked at the instrument, and listened to the creaking of the floorboards. That was the introduction. The first chord sounded only in February of 2003, and it lasted for a year and a half. A change of chord here is a worldwide event. People come from all over the world, booking tickets years in advance to see special people ceremoniously move the sandbags from one key to another. This happens once every few years. The last note change was in February of 2022, with the next scheduled for August 5, 2026. A schedule hangs in the church, detailing the notes forever into the future. The finale is planned for the year 2640. The organizers understand that no one alive today will hear the end. The organ itself will likely need repairs and renovations. The building may collapse, civilization may disappear. But there is a plan. This is a monument to human optimism. We begin a task knowing we will not see the results, but believe that in 600 years, there will still be people here, there will be music, and there will be someone to move the sandbag to the next key. So, if you feel like your life is dragging on slowly and nothing is happening, remember Halberstadt. Right now, at this very moment, an endless chord is resonating, which will outlast us all. Story number 9. The loneliest phone booth in the world. Imagine a desert. Not the sand dunes of the Sahara, but the rocky, harsh Mojave Desert in California. Heat, prickly plants, an endless road, and silence. The nearest dwelling is miles away. And right in the middle of this nothingness, at the intersection of dirt roads, stood it. A phone booth. A regular glass booth with metal frames, like in old movies. Inside hung a payphone. And the most astonishing thing is, it worked. If you picked up the receiver, you could hear a dial tone. Why is it there? It was installed in the 40s for geologists mining volcanic ash nearby. The mines closed, the geologists left. People forgot about this place. Yet, the booth remained. The Pacific Bell Company simply forgot to disconnect the line. For decades, it stood there, under the blazing sun and starry sky. Sometimes lost travelers used it, sometimes local hermits. But in the late 90s, a guy named Godfrey Daniels learned about it. He found a mark on an old map and decided to check it out. He traveled to the desert, found a phone booth, and called a friend. You won't believe where I'm calling from. Once he returned home, Gottfried posted the number of that payphone on the internet with a simple caption, "This is the most lonely phone in the world. Call it. Maybe someone will answer." And the internet went wild. At first, people called just for a joke, but then they started traveling specifically to Mojave to answer the phone. Imagine driving for 3 hours off-road, setting up a tent next to the booth, and waiting. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, the phone rings. You pick it up. Hello? Hi, this is Johannesburg, South Africa. What's the weather like there? People called from Tokyo, London, Antarctica. The booth became a confessional. Strangers shared their secrets with the receiver, knowing that on the other end of the line, in the middle of the American desert, a random person was listening, someone they would never see. People set up dates, had weddings there. The Mojave payphone became a cult. It had its own website, fans, pilgrims. But, as it often happens, fame ruined everything. Crowds of tourists began trampling the desert, leaving trash and graffiti on the glass. The National Park Service was unhappy. Local coyotes were in shock. In May 2000, a truck arrived. Workers tore down the booth, snipped the wires, and took it away forever. The number was disconnected. Now there's just a concrete slab in its place. But legend has it that if you go to that intersection, stand on the concrete, and close your eyes, you can still hear a faint, ghostly ringing through the noise of the wind, a ringing that connected the loneliness of the desert with the whole world. Story number 10. The bird that remembered what people forgot. Well, we've reached the 10th chapter. This is somewhat of an anniversary, isn't it? And for this occasion, I have saved something special. Listen, this story is about how memory can survive an entire civilization, choosing the strangest vessel one could imagine. Picture it. The year is 1799. Venezuela. The wild, impenetrable jungles of the Amazon. The heat is so intense that the air feels thick as syrup. Mosquitoes, vines. And among all this splendor, a man in a rumpled tunic pushes through with a bunch of notebooks and thermometers. This is Alexander von Humboldt, a great scientist who decided he needed to measure absolutely everything in this world. He is sailing down the Orinoco River. Surrounding him are tribes that have never seen Europeans. And there, Humboldt and his companion Aimé Bonpland arrive at the settlement of the Maipuri tribe. It was cozy, crackling fires, the smell of roasted cassava, and noise. In the middle of the village, in a cage made of sticks, sat a parrot. A perfectly ordinary Amazon parrot, old, grumpy, with plucked feathers. But as soon as the parrot opened its beak, all the Maipuri Indians fell silent and exchanged strange glances. The bird was squawking. It was saying words, but nobody, you understand, not a single person in the village, knew what it was saying. Humboldt, who was simply obsessed with linguistics, began to dig deeper. He asked the elders, well, through translators, gestures, in broken dialects. And the truth turned out to be astounding. It turned out that this parrot had previously lived in another tribe, the Atur tribe. These people had inhabited the neighboring cliffs for centuries, but a few years before the scholars' arrival, they simply vanished. There was no war or tragedy reminiscent of Hollywood dramas, just time and circumstances. The Atur tribe faded into history, merging with other peoples, and their unique language fell silent forever, for everyone. But not for this parrot. The bird lived a long time, a very long time. It listened for decades to the lullabies of the Aturs, their discussions about the weather, their greetings. And now, sitting in a cage at another tribe, the parrot was the only being on planet Earth that preserved the sounds of a dead language. Imagine that moment. Humboldt sits on a log, pulls out his notes, and begins to dictate. He records the phonetics following the bird. The parrot squawks while the scholar documents it, word by word, grammar, intonations, names of colors and trees. It was the strangest linguistic session in the history of science. A man was interviewing a bird to save the voice of an extinct people. Humboldt recorded around 60 words. That was all that remained of an entire culture. But if it weren't for that old grumpy parrot and the lack of curiosity of one German, we wouldn't even know that such sounds ever existed. It's like finding an old cassette in space with the laughter of a person whose name no one remembers. The bird is an archive, a living flash drive made of feathers and beak. When Humboldt returned to Europe and published his notes, people couldn't believe it. But the records remained, and to this day, linguists study those 40 words gifted to us by parrots. Sometimes, to preserve what is most important, nature chooses the most unexpected witnesses, and all we can do is listen. And frankly, sometimes it's worth even listening to the simple noise of wings. Who knows what stories they carry? Story number 11. The slowest show on planet Earth. Listen, we are all in a hurry. We get anxious when a web page takes longer than 5 seconds to load. We get angry at traffic lights. We want everything immediately. But in Australia, in the city of Brisbane, there is something that will make any hurry-up feel like, let's say, a cave dweller in an ocean of time. Picture an ordinary shelf at the University of Queensland. On it stands a glass vessel resembling an hourglass, though oddly shaped. Inside is a black, thick, shiny substance. It looks solid as granite. If you hit it with a hammer, it will shatter into sharp shards. This is bitumen, or as it's simply called, tar. In 1927, a professor named Thomas Parnell decided to demonstrate a simple yet remarkably strange idea to his students. He said, "Guys, this stuff only pretends to be a rock. In reality, it's a liquid. It's just very, very thick." To prove this, he heated the tar, poured it into a funnel with a sealed spout, and left it alone for 3 years, allowing the mass to settle and expel all the air. In 1930, Parnell approached the vessel and ceremoniously cut the tip of the funnel. From that moment, the great wait began. A year passed, nothing. 5 years passed. Slowly and steadily, the drop began to slide down, forming a droplet. And then, in 1938, the first drop finally fell into the glass. It took 8 years for that to happen. Professor Parnell recorded the results and continued monitoring the experiment. The second drop fell 9 years later in 1947, and the third in 1954. But here's where the irony lies. For all those decades, not a single person, understand this, no one witnessed the moment of the drop's fall. Professor Parnell died without ever seeing that triumphant splash. Another scientist, John Mainstone, took over the task. He watched the experiment for 52 years. 52 years, can you believe it? And you know what? He had catastrophic luck. In the year 1977, the drop was ready to fall at any moment. Mainstone didn't leave it for days, but on one occasion, he stepped away for 5 minutes to make himself a cup of coffee. When he returned, the drop was already at the bottom. In 1988, he decided to be clever. He didn't leave, but at the moment of the fall, he just blinked or turned away for a second. Missed it. In 2000, they set up a webcam. The whole world tuned in to watch the drop live. And guess what? At the crucial moment, the university lost power. The camera went dark for 20 minutes. When the connection was restored, the drop was already resting below. It sounds like nature is mocking science, honestly. Only in 2014, when the 9th drop fell, was it finally captured on video, thanks to modern cameras with their own power supply. But John Mainstone didn't live to see this day. He passed away just a few months before. The experiment continues. Now, in the funnel, the 10th drop is ripening. It is estimated to fall sometime in the 30s of this century. The pitch drop is 230 billion times more viscous than water. This is the longest-running laboratory experiment in the world. Sometimes we just need to pause and realize that the world lives at its own pace. And that pace is far more majestic than our hustle and bustle. However, if Australian scientists can wait decades for a single drop, then surely we can wait for the next story, right? Story number 12. The mirror that deceived the shadow in the Valley of Silence. Have you ever wondered just how much we depend on light? No, I'm not talking about the light bulbs in your home or your smartphone screen. I'm talking about the real, living sun. We've become accustomed to it simply being there, but imagine a place where every 11th of November, the sun just turns off. It disappears over the horizon and doesn't return the next morning, or even the morning after that. Welcome to Viginelle. This tiny village is located in northern Italy, in Piedmont. It lies at the bottom of such a deep and narrow valley that the mountains surrounding it resemble gigantic prison walls. Beautiful, yet maddening, but there's one catch. Every year, starting from mid-November until early February, the sun in Viginelle doesn't rise above the peaks of the surrounding mountains. That's 83 days of darkness. Imagine, almost 3 months of twilight. Cold, gray mush instead of air. People walk around pale as ghosts. They don't see their shadows. They forget what a bright blue sky looks like. For centuries, the inhabitants of Viginelle simply endured. Well, that was their fate. They drank more wine, burned more candles, and waited for the 2nd of February, the day when the first ray finally breaches the ridge and touches the bell tower. This was the main celebration. But in 2006, the mayor of the village, whose name was Pierre Franco, lost his patience. Pierre Franco was a train engineer by profession, a practical man, and honestly, a bit crazy in the best sense of the word. He said, "Since the sun doesn't come to us, we will bring it here." Listen, the neighbors in the valley just laughed in his face. "What are you going to do, Pierre Franco? Move a mountain? Build a second sun out of foil?" But the mayor was not joking. He found an architect and an engineer, and together they came up with a project that sounded like nonsense from a 19th century science fiction novel. They decided to install a giant mirror on top of a mountain at an altitude of 1,100 meters above the village. Imagine that massive structure. A polished steel sheet measuring 8 meters wide, 5 meters tall, with an area of 40 square meters. This was not just a piece of metal. The mirror was connected to a computer and equipped with motors. It was smart. It was supposed to slowly turn throughout the day, tracking the sun and catching its rays to reflect them directly down onto the town square of Viganella. Raising the funds was not easy. The project cost around 100,000 euros. For a village with fewer than 200 people, that was a fortune. But they did it. Helicopters lifted steel beams onto the slope. Workers balanced on the edge of the abyss. And then, on December 17th, 2006, a miracle happened. The whole town gathered in the square. People wore festive clothing. Children ran around the fountain. It was gray and frosty, as it always is in December. But suddenly, wait, a bright spot appeared on the wall of the old church. It grew larger and brighter until it transformed into a real, warm, golden rectangle of light. The crowd went silent. Some people cried. The elderly, who had spent their winters in gloom all their lives, turned their faces to this artificial sun and smiled. It truly became warm in the square. You could sit on a bench and squint as if it were mid-May. Well, technically it was just a reflection, but for the people of Viganella, it was a victory over geography. Pierre Franco had achieved the impossible. He had tricked the shadow. Since then, this mirror has worked every winter. It has become a landmark. The world learned about Viganella. Engineers from Norway even came to learn from their experience, hoping to illuminate their northern cities. Sometimes, to change your life, you don't need to wait for nature's mercy or move mountains. You just need to correctly position a mirror. And frankly, it's a great reason to think about how light can always be found, even when you're at the bottom of a deep valley. Now, as we bask under the Italian sun, let's shift our attention to other equally strange inventions that have changed the world in the most ridiculous ways. Story number 13. The strangest garden decoration ever hired by humankind. Have you ever wondered how wealthy people display their status? Well, today it's yachts, private jets, or, I don't know, gold watches the size of saucers. But in the 15th century in England, the aristocrats had a trend compared to which any modern eccentricity seems utterly sane. Imagine a luxurious estate, expansive grounds, mist, and neatly trimmed lawns. And somewhere deep within that park, amidst artificial ruins or in a shady cave, sits a man, a real, living man. He was referred to as a decorative hermit. Honestly, it sounds absurd, but it was an absolute reality. Wealthy landowners of that era were simply obsessed with melancholy. It was fashionable to appear profound, contemplative, and a bit sad. And what better way to emphasize your philosophical leanings than by having a real hermit living in your garden? It was a fully fledged job. Advertisements appeared in newspapers. A man was required to reside in the grotto. The contract term was 7 years. The conditions were, to say the least, specific. Imagine being given a small hut made of branches and stones. Inside was a straw bed, a table, a chair, and maybe a couple of books in Latin. You were not allowed to cut your hair, beard, or nails for the entire 7 years. You had to wear a rough robe made of burlap. You were forbidden to speak to guests on the premises. You were even prohibited from leaving the park. Why would the owner want this? Now picture the Baron inviting friends over for tea. They stroll through the garden and the Baron casually remarks, "Just over this hill I have an old sage living." He has renounced the world and reflects on the transience of existence. Guests peek into the cave, see a scruffy, silent man, and marvel, "Oh, what exquisite taste our Baron has! What depth of feeling! Essentially, he was a living garden gnome. Of course, not everyone could endure such a schedule. Many hermits fled after 3 months, unable to withstand the solitude and the ban on basic hygiene. But those who managed to stick it out until the end received a fortune, quite a substantial sum for those times. It is said that one such professional sage, after completing his contract, bought himself a house and opened a practice. Irony, right? 7 years of silence, only to chat with visitors at the counter for the rest of his life. Gradually, the trend faded. Aristocrats realized that living people were too troublesome. They had whims, wanted to eat, and sometimes secretly ventured into the nearby village for a beer. Then, in place of living hermits, ceramic figures emerged. Yes, the very garden gnomes we see today in gardens. They are direct descendants of those bearded souls from English parks. So, if you ever see a plastic little man in a red hat among raspberry bushes, remember that once, this was a prestigious and very peculiar job. The world is full of things that seem normal until we delve into their history. And honestly, it's a good thing today. All it takes to decorate a garden is a trip to a hardware store, not placing an ad for a bearded philosopher on a 7-year contract. Story number 14. How a stamp with a volcano fooled an entire superpower. Picture this. Washington, 1902. The U.S. Senate is hot, but not from the weather. It's from debate. The issue of the century is being settled. Where to construct a canal that would connect two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. At stake are billions of dollars, global dominance, and eternal glory. There were two options, Panama and Nicaragua. To be honest, Panama was the underdog back then. The project there was considered a failure. The French had already tried to build it and nearly went bankrupt. On the other hand, Nicaragua was a dream. Wide rivers, a vast lake in the middle, and a convenient terrain. Almost all experts, engineers, and politicians unanimously declared, "Let's build in Nicaragua." It seemed like a done deal. 90 out of 100 would have bet all their savings on this option. But there was one man who desperately needed Panama. His name was Philippe Jean Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer, adventurer, and genius of manipulation. He understood that dry numbers and logic wouldn't work against convinced senators. He needed something emotional, something that would evoke primal fear. Nature and a little bit of luck helped him out. The volcano Momotombo in Nicaragua awoke. It wasn't a planetary disaster, just a small ash eruption. Fearing for their reputation, the Nicaraguan government immediately issued an official statement. Everything is calm, no eruptions, the volcanoes are asleep. Bunau-Varilla read this and smiled. He went to the post office and bought hundreds of Nicaraguan postage stamps featuring the value Vadim Centava. Do you know what was depicted on them? That very volcano Momotombo. And, ironically, the image showed a thick, billowing column of smoke rising from the peak. The Nicaraguans printed this for aesthetics, for drama. Bunau-Varilla stuck each stamp onto a separate sheet of paper, and beneath each one, he wrote just one phrase: Official Certificate of Volcanic Activity in Nicaragua, the pride of the local post office. The morning before the decisive vote, each American senator found this sheet of paper on their desk. Imagine their faces. Dignified men in tailcoats, picking up a small piece of paper. They see a volcano. They see smoke. They remember recent eruptions in Martinique that erased an entire city from the map. And they think, wait, are we going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in building a canal next to this powder keg? Logic? Forget it. Economy? Who cares when there's a smoking mountain next to Mark? The result was staggering. The Senate, which just the day before was wholeheartedly in favor of Nicaragua, suddenly voted for Panama. The difference was merely a few votes, the very votes that wavered at the sight of the postage stamp. And that's how Panama became what it is today, while Nicaragua remained with its lakes and quiet volcanoes. One tiny lie in a picture, created for aesthetic appeal, changed the logistics of the entire planet. And honestly, every time I stick a stamp on an envelope, though who does that anymore, I think about how even the smallest thing can carry the weight of millions of tons of gold. Now, since we've talked about how visual images can drive people insane, let's move to another place where one painting made people believe in something that isn't real. Story number 15. The King Who Ruled a Paper Empire from the Old Shed. Imagine the early 70s, a small town called Hay-on-Wye. To be honest, it's a bit of a depressing place. The mines are closing, the youth are leaving, and the buildings are crumbling. A typical story from the countryside. And here lived an eccentric Oxford graduate named Richard Booth. Richard loved old books. He believed they carried the soul of the world. He began buying up libraries in America that were simply going to be thrown away. He shipped them by the container load to Hay-on-Wye and filled everything: old fire stations, vacant cinemas, even abandoned grain warehouses. The town transformed into one giant book dump, but there were still very few tourists. Then, April 1st, 1977, arrived. Richard Booth stepped into the square, donned a homemade crown, draped an old carpet over his shoulders like a cloak, and declared, "Hay-on-Wye is a sovereign kingdom of books, and I am your King Richard V. Or the First. What's the difference?" Richard's friends laughed. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. The British government, to be honest, didn't notice a thing. But Richard wasn't joking. He created everything a state would need: his own government, appointed his beloved dog as foreign minister, printed his own passports on thick paper, and even established his own currency, the book pound. Want to gain citizenship in Hay-on-Wye? Buy a book and get a stamp in your passport. But his most brilliant decision was about titles. Richard began selling nobility. Anyone could become an earl, a duke, or a knight of the Kingdom of Books for a small donation to support the libraries. Imagine walking into a pub and finding 3 barons and 2 marquises, who are actually just postal workers and farmers, but today they are nobles. And it worked. It worked spectacularly. Rumors of the Kingdom of Books and its crazy king spread around the world. Journalists from New York, Tokyo, and Paris flocked to the tiny Welsh town. Tourists arrived by the thousands. Everyone wanted a passport from the king himself and to buy a rare book in a former stable. Hay-on-Wye became the world's first literary village. Today, there are 40 books for every resident. It's the world's capital of literature, hosting one of the most prestigious festivals on the planet. The town was saved not by subsidies, but by the pure, concentrated imagination of one person. Richard Booth ruled his paper kingdom for 40 years. He never took politics seriously, but he genuinely believed that humor and books could breathe life into dead stones. He passed away in 2019, but Hay-on-Wye still considers itself a special place. The streets are lined with honesty shelves. You take a book and put your money through a small slit in the wall. No locks. After all, in the Kingdom of Books, all are gentlemen. The irony is that one man with a cardboard crown did more for his region's economy than a whole cabinet of ministers in London. All because he wasn't afraid to look silly. As we leave this cozy kingdom, let's delve into the archives of a completely different kind, where nature decided to create something that no king could ever imagine. Story number 16. The street that taught humanity to walk without moving their legs. Picture Paris, 1900, the World's Fair. The City of Light is bubbling like champagne in a glass. Strange constructions, electricity, and chatter are everywhere, while ladies in lavish dresses gasp in fright at the sight of the first automobiles. But the most incredible thing wasn't found in the pavilions. It surrounded the entire exhibition complex in a loop. It was called the Street of the Future, or the Moving Sidewalk. To be honest, it was the world's first truly gigantic moving sidewalk. It stretched 3.5 kilometers in length. Imagine an endless wooden belt floating 6 meters above the ground, supported by steel columns. It wound its way past the Eiffel Tower, along the banks of the Seine, and through the gardens. But it wasn't just a boring path. It had a rhythm. The system consisted of 3 parallel platforms. The first one was stationary, for those who wanted to simply gaze at the spectacle. The second moved at 4 kilometers per hour, like a leisurely strolling pedestrian. And the third platform was for the brave. It zoomed along at 10 kilometers per hour. Back then, That was almost a cosmic speed for someone standing still. Listen, it was absolute chaos and excitement at the same time. People were initially afraid to step on it, but imagine standing on solid ground as an entire street clatters and glides past you. To get on, one had to make a kind of leap of faith. Newspapers of the time published instructions. First, place one foot in the direction of movement. Don't resist the impulse. But once the Parisians got a taste for it, madness ensued. It became the main attraction of the fair. In just a few months, more than 50 million people rode the street of the future. Picture a crowd in top hats and corsets rushing past palaces without taking a single step. People held picnics on the platform, they read newspapers, some even managed to dance, while boys and newsboys jumped from the fast platform to the slow one and back, like true stunt performers. The most astonishing thing was that this 3-kilometer behemoth ran on electricity. Silent, environmentally friendly, futuristic. It seemed that within 10 years, all the cities in the world would be like this. Why walk when the city can take you to the bakery? But, as often happens, the future proved too costly and fragile. The exhibition closed, and the mechanisms were dismantled for scrap metal. The technology of the endless sidewalk fell asleep for a while, leaving us with only escalators and subways and treadmills and airports. Yet, for those few months, Paris truly became a city from a science fiction novel without noise, hooves, and coal smoke. Just people floating above the city to the sounds of orchestras. And honestly, whenever I stand on an escalator that moves up for 30 seconds, I always think back to that 3-kilometer belt in Paris. We thought this was the start of a new era, yet it was merely a beautiful flash of imagination that faded along with the lights of the exhibition. So, are you ready to come down from the heavenly walkway to Earth? Ahead of us lies a story about how one small object can spark a great controversy that lasted hundreds of years. Story number 17. The Lead Weight of a Golden Deception. Imagine London, May 15, 1855. London Bridge Station, evening. Fog, of course. What would London be without it? The steam engine puffs, releasing clouds of white steam that mingle with the smell of coal and wet stone. There's a flurry of activity on the platform, but 3 massive iron boxes draw everyone's attention. Inside, gold. Bars and coins worth 12,000 pounds sterling. In those times, that was not just a fortune, it was the budget of a small town. The gold was bound for Paris for the needs of the army fighting in the Crimea. The security system was thought to be flawless back then. The boxes were locked with 2 different locks. The keys were held by the most trusted individuals. One set with the station masters in London and Folkestone, the other with the captain of the ferry across the channel. Getting inside was impossible, at least that's what the newspapers claimed. Now listen closely, here comes the trick. The train departs, the wheels clatter. The gold-laden car is locked from the outside, and within, silence reigns. The gold rests peacefully in safes, while the train speeds through the night. But when the boxes were ceremoniously opened in Paris a day later, a grave silence fell on the room. The bars had completely vanished. Instead of gold, the boxes were neatly filled with ordinary lead bullets and shot. The weight was meticulously calibrated to the gram. Even experienced loaders suspected nothing. The boxes were just as heavy as when they had been sent off. How? It was a locked box in a locked room. Frankly, the preparation for this scheme took more than a year. The names of the heroes of this, well, let's say intellectual raid, are Edward Agar and William Pierce. Agar was a brilliant burglar. He didn't use dynamite, he used patience. He traveled this route for months. He bribed the guards? No, he simply befriended them. He treated them to ale, he listened to their stories. And one day, when a guard was distracted for just a minute, Agar made a key impression in a piece of ordinary soft wax. But the most incredible incident occurred during the heist itself. Agar and Pierce did not storm the car, they simply bought first-class tickets. When the train started moving, they, using the help of an accomplice conductor, you can't do it without someone on the inside, sneaked into the baggage car. Imagine this scene. The train hurtles through the darkness, metal screeches, the floor shakes, and two men in top hats, illuminated by a tiny flashlight, opened safes with fake keys. They transferred the gold into their bags, and to ensure the boxes didn't feel lighter, they had beforehand filled bags with lead shot, the weight of which they had meticulously learned by peeking at loading documents. They finished their work just before Folkestone, calmly disembarked with heavy suitcases, no chases, no gunfire. You know what their downfall was? Greed. No, not their own. A year later, Agar ended up in prison for another petty matter. He asked Pierce to pass some money to his former girlfriend and child. Pierce decided the money was more useful to him. The girl, left with nothing, went to the police and revealed everything she knew about the grand heist. Thus, the story of one of the boldest robberies of the 19th century came to an end. The money was never fully recovered. They say they are still hidden somewhere in the basements of old London. The irony is that after that incident, engineers completely redesigned the locking system on the railway. But, as we know, no lock can stand against human patience and wax. So, have you felt the taste of Victorian adventure? Now, let's change the scenery and go to a place where gold was not stolen, but literally grown. However, it wasn't quite what it seemed at first glance. Story number 18. A forest that saw the far side of the moon. Picture this. January 1971. The launch pad at Cape Canaveral. An enormous Saturn V rocket stands still, shrouded in clouds of white steam. The roar of flame shakes the ground. The Apollo 14 mission is heading to the moon. On board, 3 astronauts, Alan Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, and Stuart Roosa. But there was also another crew, a very tiny one. In Stuart Roosa's personal luggage lay a small metal container. Inside it were about 500 seeds: pine, sycamore, sequoia, fir, and birch. Stuart didn't choose this cargo just for fun. Before becoming an astronaut, he was a smoke jumper, a firefighting parachutist who jumped into the heart of forest fires. He loved the forest, and he wanted to take it with him to the stars. Listen, this was not an official part of the scientific program. It was an experiment by the Forest Service that was allowed as a bonus. While Shepard and Mitchell strolled on the lunar surface and played golf, Stuart Roosa remained in orbit in the command module alone. He made 34 orbits around the moon, and along with him in this icy void 500,000 kilometers away from home, 500 tiny dormant lives revolved. The pine seed saw craters and lifeless plains. The birch seed felt weightlessness. But when they returned to Earth, something unexpected happened. During the disinfection process, the seed container burst under the vacuum. Bam! 500 tiny seeds scattered across the chamber. The scientists were in despair. They thought it was all over, that radiation, vacuum, and stress had killed them. It seemed the experiment was over before it even began. But foresters are a stubborn people. They carefully collected the seeds, grain by grain, and planted them in special nurseries. And you know what? Almost all of them sprouted. It turned out that the lunar seeds not only survived, but also germinated into sprouts that were indistinguishable from regular ones, although, to be honest, some people are still looking for something strange in them. You know, a special shine to the needles, or whispers in an incomprehensible language at night. In the mid-70s, as America celebrated its 200th anniversary, these seedlings, which were called lunar trees, were distributed across the country and even around the world. They were planted at the White House, in parks in Brazil, in botanical gardens in Switzerland, and even in Japan. They are still growing there today. Huge, powerful sycamores and pines. You can walk up to such a tree, lean against its bark, and feel the warmth of a living plant. But at the same time, hold on. You are touching a tree whose heart, back then still in the form of a tiny seed, saw the far side of the moon. The irony is that, over time, the lists of places where these trees were planted got lost in the archives. Many of them grow in ordinary urban parks without any signs. You can walk your dog past a space traveler and not even be aware of it. This is a story about how even the smallest seed can conquer the abyss and return simply to provide shade. And honestly, it makes you look at a typical park in a completely different light. While we stand in the shade of moonlit pines, let's take a moment to listen. Because sometimes the loudest events in history begin in silence, where someone simply decided to make the right choice. Story number 19. The tiny island that was traded for New York. Imagine an endless ocean, heat, salty sprays, and tiny lost islands in Indonesia, known as the Banda Islands. At that time, this was the only place on the entire planet Earth where nutmeg grew. It was a gold mine. The nut was worth more than gold. It was used as medicine, as a preservative, and as a symbol of incredible wealth. Among these islands was one very small island. It was called Rune. Honestly, it was just a rock in the ocean, 3 kilometers long and less than a kilometer wide. But on this rock grew nutmeg trees. This piece of land became the reason for the strangest and perhaps most profitable, or unprofitable depending on how you look at it, exchange in human history. Listen, in the mid-15th century, 2 superpowers clashed over this island, England and the Netherlands. The Dutch wanted total control. They wanted to monopolize every speck of nutmeg in the world, while the British simply didn't want to back down. They established themselves on the island of Run and built a fort there. It was a stalemate. On one side, the tiny Run packed with spices, and on the other, the Dutch who had taken over a small, muddy, and honestly not very promising trading post in North America known as Manhattan. Back then, it was called New Amsterdam. There lived fishermen, fur traders, and it was all wetlands. Then came the year 1667. The sides sat down at the negotiation table in the city of Breda. Everyone was tired of arguing. The world needed to be divided somehow. And that's when the Dutch made a bold move. They said, listen, give us this tiny island Rune. We need the nutmeg. We need the monopoly. In exchange, take our New Amsterdam in America. It's just swamps and no profit anyway. Imagine that moment. The British scratched their heads. On one hand, there was guaranteed income from spices here and now, and on the other, an unclear settlement on the other side of the world. But they agreed. They shook hands. The Treaty of Breda was signed. The Netherlands received Run and became the sole ruler of the world nutmeg market. They were happy. They thought they struck gold. The British renamed New Amsterdam to New York, and, well, you know what happened next. The irony of history is overwhelming. 300 years passed. The spice monopoly collapsed when nutmeg seedlings were secretly taken and planted in other colonies. The price of the nut fell. Today, the island of Run is a quiet, forgotten place where people live by fishing and farming. And New York? New York has become the financial heart of the world, the capital of ambition, a city that never sleeps. The Dutch acquired spices for a century. The English gained control over the future continent. Every time I see the skyline of Manhattan with its glass and steel skyscrapers, I think of that little island in Indonesia. All this power, all this glamour, began with someone's strong desire to control the supply of nutmeg. Honestly, it makes you wonder about the deals we make today. What seems precious to us now may just be dust in 100 years. So, are you ready to move on? Because around every corner of history, there awaits a new, even stranger coincidence. Story number 20. A NASA engineer who created the most profitable flood in the world in his own bathroom. Imagine the early 80s, Alabama. The heat is so intense you could fry an egg on the hood of a car. In his garage works a man named Lonnie Johnson. Honestly, Lonnie is a true geek in the coolest sense of the word. He works at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He designs power systems for the Galileo spacecraft, which is set to journey to Jupiter. He's the kind of guy who knows about pressure, gases, and thermodynamics more than any of us knows about the contents of our fridge. But in the evenings at home, Lonnie had a dream. He wanted to create an environmentally friendly heat pump. He thought, what if, instead of using harmful Freon, I used ordinary water under pressure? One evening, Lonnie was tinkering in his bathroom. He built a strange contraption out of tubes and homemade fittings. He connected it to the faucet, pumped up the pressure, and listen, there was a deafening whistle. A powerful jet of water burst from his device. But this wasn't just a trickle. It was a robust, perfectly straight stream that shot across the bathroom, knocked down the shower curtain, and hit the opposite wall. Lonnie froze. Anyone else in his position would have cursed and gone for a towel to clean up the puddle, but Lonnie was an engineer. He looked at that stream, then at his half-finished ecosystem and thought, "Forget the pump. This is the most powerful water gun I've ever seen." Back then, water guns were, frankly, pathetic. Little plastic things that sprayed about half a meter, and here was the power of a jet engine in your hands. But the road to success wasn't smooth. It took Lonnie 7 years to refine his idea. He crafted parts on a lathe himself. He knocked on the doors of major companies, and you know what? He was rejected everywhere. Too complicated, too expensive. Who needs this? Finally, at a toy fair, he met representatives from a small company named Laramie. He didn't even have a nice prototype, just a bundle of tubes and a plastic soda bottle taped together. Lonnie pumped the pressure right in the office and shot it across the entire room. Silence. A pause. The jaws of the executives dropped slowly. And that's how the Super Soaker was born. Listen, it was a cultural shock. In the very first year, they sold these water guns for $200 million. Children, and adults too if we're being honest, engaged in real water battles all over the world. Lonnie Johnson, the man who built spacecraft, became a millionaire simply because he loved playing with water pressure. The irony is that Lonnie didn't spend his earnings on yachts and golden toilets. He reinvested them into science. He founded his own laboratory, where today he invents new types of batteries and solar panels. This is a story about how a scientific mindset is ultimately the ability to see wonder in a simple spray from a faucet. And, to be honest, the next time you soak someone with a water gun on a hot day, remember, behind that stream of water is a NASA genius who just didn't wipe up a puddle in the bathroom on time. Now, while our clothes dry, let's take a look at another place where one chance encounter in the woods changed how we fasten our jackets today. Story number 21. How burrs and dog fur taught humanity to fasten things. Imagine it's 1941, Switzerland, the Alps. The air is so clean that you want to drink it. A man named George de Mistral strolls along a mountain path, happily accompanied by his beloved dog. Honestly, it was an ordinary walk. George wasn't searching for the formula for immortality or trying to unlock the secrets of the universe. He was simply enjoying the view. But when they returned home, George noticed that both his trousers and his dog's fur were literally covered in burrs. You know that feeling? You try to pull them off and they resist. They latch onto the fabric as if it's their last chance for survival. Anyone else would have just cursed and grabbed a brush. But George was an engineer to the core. He paused, incredibly curious about how this tiny green thing managed to cling to a simple thread so tightly. He took out a microscope, placed a burr under the lens, and gasped. Listen, nature is a genius designer. Under the microscope, the burr didn't just look like a ball of fluff. It was an army of hundreds of tiny, perfectly shaped hooks. When the dog ran past, those hooks latched onto any fabric loop or hair. Simply elegant and, honestly, incredibly effective. George decided, I will do the same. I will create a fastener that works like a burr. But hold on, it wasn't that simple. George's friends and colleagues laughed at him. George's, seriously? You want to replace buttons and zippers with some plastic hooks? Get real. 10 years. Just imagine, 10 years he struggled with the technology. He tried cotton, but it wore out quickly. He experimented with nylon under the microscope, trying to reproduce those very hooks. He literally handcrafted thousands of little loops and hooks on a strip. Ultimately, he found the perfect combination: 2 strips, one with soft loops and the other with stiff hooks. Press them together, and they connect with a distinct sound. Velcro. He named his invention Velcro. This is a contraction of 2 French words, velu, which means hairy, and crochet, which means hook. But the world did not immediately appreciate this novelty. Tailors in Paris and London wrinkled their noses. It looks cheap. It ruins the look of the suit. Who needs this noise in polite society? The fastener gathered dust on the shelves. Do you know who saved George and his Velcro? Space. In the 1960s, NASA was looking for a way for astronauts to secure their spacesuits and keep items from floating around in zero gravity. Zippers would stick, and buttons were impossible to feel with thick gloves, but Velcro just stuck, and it was done. Once people saw that guys heading to the stars were using Velcro, its popularity soared to the heavens. Velcro began to appear on sneakers, jackets, wallets, and even diving gear. The irony is that George de Mestral became a millionaire simply because he took the time to look through a microscope at something that frustrated others. This is a story about how the greatest ideas often quite literally stick to us while we're out for a walk. You just need to be able to look at the world through the eyes of a child and an engineer simultaneously. And honestly, every time I hear that familiar rip of Velcro on shoes, I remember that dog in the Alps. Without it, our future would be much more confusing and cumbersome. Well, let's buckle up tighter. We're moving on. We're set to hear a tale about how one very strange package proved that human ingenuity knows no bounds, especially when it comes to love for family. Story number 22. How Texas Cactus Saved the Pride of France. Imagine the mid-19th century. France is in its golden age. The vineyards of Provence, Bordeaux, and Champagne are thriving. Families have been growing the same vines for centuries. Wine is not just a business, it's the DNA of a nation. And then, suddenly, something strange begins. First in one vineyard, then another, the leaves start to yellow, vines dry out, roots turn to dust, and people panic. They think it's a curse, bad weather, or the wrath of heaven, but the cause was tiny. Aphids, Phylloxera, a small insect that was accidentally imported from America along with decorative seedlings. Listen, this was a national disaster. In just a few years, France lost almost half of all its vineyards. The government offered rewards, scientists tried everything, burying dead frogs at the roots to soaking them with white wine. Nothing helped. The pride of France was literally dying before their eyes. But at the same time in Texas, in the town of Odenville, there lived a man named Thomas Volney Manson. Manson was, to be honest, a fanatic. He loved wild grapes. He wandered through the forests and canyons of Texas, collecting samples that no one considered valuable. Sour, hard berries that were hardly edible. But Manson noticed one incredible thing. The Texas grape did not care about Phylloxera at all. The insect would bite the roots, but the vine only grew stronger. So when French winemakers were ready to throw ashes on their heads and start growing potatoes instead of grapes, Manson proposed a wild idea. Guys, he said, well, in the letter, of course, don't try to treat your vines, it's useless, just transplant them. The idea was to take the powerful, indestructible roots of Texas grapes and graft on delicate French vines. Grafting, a surgical operation at the plant level. Imagine the scale. Thousands and thousands of boxes of Texas roots floated across the Atlantic. French farmers, who at first skeptically twisted their faces at this American thinking he understood our noble craft, began to try in desperation. And a miracle happened. The vines took root. The French flavor remained the same because the top was French, but the legs, which were in the ground, were now Texas. Phylloxera nibbled at them and broke its teeth. France was completely saved. In 1988, the French government did something unprecedented. They awarded Thomas Volney Manson the Legion of Honor. He became the second American in history after Thomas Edison to receive this high honor. The city of Denison in Texas became a sister city to the French city of Cognac. The irony is that today, almost all of Europe, Italy, Spain, and France drinks wine that grows on American roots. We saved their traditions with our wild weeds. Honestly, it's a great reminder that sometimes salvation doesn't come from high technology, but from the ability to see the strength in what grows under your fence. Now, having sorted out the vineyards, let's move to another place, where people also tried to create something perfect, but faced a force that could not be anticipated. Story number 23. The tale of the glue that didn't want to hold anything and bookmarks for Psalms. Imagine the year 1968. A laboratory at the company 3M. Something bubbles in the test tubes, smelling of chemicals. People in white coats frown. Among them is Dr. Spencer Silver. To be honest, Spencer had an ambitious task. He was asked to create superglue. You understand, a glue that would permanently bond parts of airplanes or enormous machines, something incredibly powerful. Spencer mixed components, changed formulas, and then he got this strange, slightly cloudy substance. He applied it to a surface, pressed down, and gasped. But not out of delight. You see, the glue was, well, downright pitiful. It didn't hold anything. Just a little pull and the surfaces came apart. But the strangest thing was something else. The glue left no marks. It could be stuck and unstuck 1,000 times, and still it lazily clung to the paper without damaging it. For aircraft manufacturing, it was a complete failure. Junk. Spencer Silver wandered around his colleagues' offices for several years, showing off his adhesive and saying, "Look at this strange glue. It hardly sticks at all." Everyone nodded, smiled, and forgot about him. 5 years passed. At the same company, there was another guy, Arthur Fry. And Arthur had a problem of a completely different kind. On Sundays, he sang in the church choir. Imagine the solemn atmosphere, the organ. Arthur opens the book of Psalms, and then all his paper bookmarks, which he had carefully made throughout Saturday, flew out and scattered across the floor. Arthur was angry. Arthur was cursing. Quietly, of course, because he was in church. He needed a bookmark that would stick to the page, but would not damage the old paper when it needed to be removed. And then it hit him. Wait a minute. That strange, useless glue from Silver. He ran to the lab. He and Spencer started experimenting. First, they applied the glue to small pieces of paper. And do you know what color they chose? Yellow. Just because there was a pack of yellow paper lying around in the next room. Purely by chance. Listen, it was it. The perfect note-taking solution. You could stick it on the fridge, on the monitor, or on a colleague's forehead, and it would stay put until you got tired of it. The company's marketers didn't believe at first. Who would buy sticky notes with bad glue? But they decided to conduct an experiment. They sent out free packs to offices of large companies. The result was like an explosion. People didn't just use them, they became addicted. Secretaries wrote love confessions on them. Bosses stuck them on reports, and programmers plastered them all around their space. Thus, Post-it notes were born. The irony is that the most profitable product the company has seen in decades came from a failed attempt to stick paper airplanes together. Spencer Silver was looking for strength and found delicacy. Arthur Fry was looking for silence in church and found a way to organize the chaos in our minds. Honestly, the next time you stick a yellow note reminding you to buy bread, remember this. Sometimes what seems to us to be useless junk is just the solution to a problem we have not yet realized. Now, while our notes are securely stuck, let's look at another place where one person decided to challenge gravity itself using only his wits and a very long rope. Story number 24. 3 hours that saved the wardrobe of the whole world. Imagine New York, April 1849. Dirty streets, horse-drawn carriages, the smell of coal smoke. In his workshop sits a man named Walter Hunt. Honestly, Walter was a walking disaster for any investor. He was incredibly talented, but had absolutely no knack for managing money. He invented the world's first sewing machine, but didn't patent it because he feared it would put tailors out of work. He came up with a nail-making machine, improved the forest saw, created a new type of spinning wheel, and yet he was always broke, chronically, hopelessly. That morning, a friend came to visit him. The friend didn't come just for a chat. He came for his $20. Listen, today that seems like a small amount. Well, a couple of shopping trips, but back then it was a decent sum. Walter threw up his hands. There was no money. But the friend was insistent. He said, "Walter, you're an inventor. Come up with something simple right now, sell the idea, and pay me back." Walter sighed. He picked up a piece of brass wire about 8 inches long from the table. He started twisting it. Walter's fingers were accustomed to working with metal. He bent it this way and that, mumbling to himself. An hour passed. His friend sat in the corner reading the newspaper. 2 hours went by. Walter found some pliers and made a loop in the center of the wire. It was a spring. Then he sharpened one end, and at the other end he crafted a tiny lock so that the sharp tip would tuck inside and not prick his fingers. 3 hours, exactly 3 hours, were spent creating what we now call the safety pin from a piece of wire. Before this, pins were simply sharp needles with heads. They constantly fell out, caused injuries, and ruined clothing. Walter Hunt created the perfect safety mechanism. But here's where it gets really interesting. Walter was so happy that he could finally pay off a debt that he rushed to a company called Grace. He showed them his safety pin. "How much do you want for this?" they asked. Walter thought for a moment. He needed to pay his friend $15, and then something extra. $400, he blurted out. $400 for a patented item that would be made in trillions. The company agreed instantly.
Listen, Walter Hunt was thrilled. He gave $15 to his friend, and with the rest, well, he probably bought himself a new workbench or paid some bills. He had no idea that the Grace Company would make millions, billions from it.
Hunt's safety pin became the standard. It saved torn dresses at balls, held diapers on babies, and became indispensable in medicine. Ironically, Walter Hunt died in poverty 10 years after his swiftest invention. He was too kind for this business world, but his tiny wire loop still resides in every sewing basket on the planet. Frankly, this story illustrates that genius doesn't always require complex electronics. Sometimes it just requires a commitment to a debt and the ability to see solutions in a single movement of the fingers. And while the pin securely holds our reality together, let's turn our gaze elsewhere, to a place where people also tried to create something small, but ended up building an entire state that no one recognized, yet everyone remembered. Story number 25. How wallpaper paste became the tastiest toy on the planet. Imagine the city of Cincinnati in 1955. The winters were harsh, and people heated their homes with coal. A lot of coal. This meant that by spring, the walls of every apartment were covered in a thick, oily layer of black soot. Back then, wallpapers were made of paper. You couldn't just wipe them down with a wet cloth, or they would fall apart. This is where the Kutal Company entered the scene. They produced a strange product, a soft, pliable dough that resembled paste. You would take a lump of this substance, roll it across the wall, and it would act like a magnet, absorbing all the dirt and soot. A perfect business, right? As long as there was coal, there was work. But progress can be a harsh reality. Honestly, the Kutal Company found itself on the brink of collapse just a couple of years later, as people started switching to gas and electricity. The soot has disappeared, but those who remained loyal to old habits repapered the walls with new vinyl wallpaper that could be washed with water. Joe McVicker, who led the company, looked at warehouses filled with tons of that gray, almond-scented paste and realized, this is the end. However, Joe had a daughter-in-law named Kay Zufall. She worked as a preschool teacher. One day, Kay read in a newspaper that ordinary wallpaper paste could be used for crafts. She knew that regular modeling clay at that time was, frankly, terrible. Hard as a rock, it left hands dirty and required the strength of an adult man to knead it. Kay went to Joe's warehouse and took a couple of cans of his useless product. Listen, the kids in her class were thrilled. This dough was soft. It didn't stick to their hands and it held its shape perfectly. Kay called Joe and said, "Listen, forget about the wallpaper. Your product is the best toy I've ever seen." Johnny began to argue. He was in despair, and despair is a great motivator for bold ideas. He took out the detergent from the formula so the kids wouldn't get sick, added some bright colors, and changed the scent, from a technical aroma to vanilla and cherry. They named it Play-Doh. At first they tried to market it as a school supply, but real success came when they appeared on television. One demonstration on a children's show, and the next morning, stores were besieged by an army of parents. The irony is that the gray, dull cleaning substance became a symbol of creativity and joy for millions of children. Today, nearly 70 years later, the formula for Play-Doh remains virtually unchanged. Moreover, the scent of this dough is officially recognized as a trademark. So deeply has it engraved itself into the memories of entire generations. This is a story about how even when your wall collapses, you can mold something beautiful from the pieces. The key is to notice in time how children delight in what you considered to be trash. Now, while our modeling clay masterpieces are drying, let's take a look into the archives of a completely different kind, where people also tried to create something small, but it ultimately led to one of the largest and strangest hoaxes in the history of art. Story number 26. The spring that learned to walk when it had nothing else to do. Imagine the year 1943. Philadelphia. The cramped shipbuilding company. The clang of metal. The smell of hot steel. Sparks from welding. This place, to be honest, looks nothing like a workshop of wonders. Here, battleships and destroyers are being built for a great war. In one of the cramped offices sits Richard James. He is a mechanical engineer. His task is to solve a serious problem. When a ship sails on a rough sea, it gets shaken. This shaking disrupts sensitive instruments, navigation systems, chronometers, radio stations. Richard must create a spring system that absorbs these shocks. Listen, he tried hundreds of options. He had dozens of different springs on his shelves, thick, thin, steel, copper. He was searching for the perfect balance. And then one day, while reaching for yet another sheet of drafting paper, Richard accidentally brushed against one of the experimental springs on the shelf. Any other engineer would have simply watched as the piece of metal fell to the floor and cursed. But Richard froze. The spring didn't just drop. It gracefully hopped from the shelf to a stack of books, from the stack of books to the table, from the table to the chair, and then right onto the floor, where it marched for a couple more seconds before coming to a stop. It was like magic. It was as if this piece of steel wire suddenly had its own legs and a desire to take a walk. Richard went home and told his wife Betty about it. "Listen," he said, "I think I found something interesting. It doesn't save equipment on ships, but it walks." To be honest, Betty looked at him like he was crazy at first, but when Richard demonstrated the spring's walk down the stairs, she understood everything immediately. Betty had a great intuition for things that could bring joy to people. She opened a dictionary and found the word slinky. It translates to smooth, sinuous, and graceful. However, the path to success was, let's say, not the smoothest. Richard and Betty had only $500 in savings. They found a small workshop that agreed to make the first batch of 400 pieces. Richard packed them himself into boxes. They went around toy stores, but the owners just shook their heads. Who needs a spring? It's just a piece of metal. Kids want dolls and soldiers. Finally, just before Christmas of 1945, Gimbel's department store allowed them to set up a small display in the toy department. Listen, it was a catastrophe. No one approached. People walked by, looking at Richard with pity. He stood there for an hour and a half, sweating from excitement, and then he decided to take a chance. He took one slinky, placed it at the top of a special inclined board, and released it. The spring started to walk. Clack, clack, clack. A crowd gathered instantly. Children froze. Adults began to whisper. After an hour and a half, all 400 pieces were sold. People were literally tearing them from his hands. Richard and Betty created an empire. It turned out that in a world full of complex mechanisms and formidable machines, people simply lacked something simple, rhythmic, and frankly, absolutely useless except for pure delight. The irony is that the spring that failed its Navy test ultimately became the most popular toy in American history. It even had the chance to travel to space. Astronauts took it into orbit to test gravity. This is a story about how a mistake is just an opportunity to see things from a different angle. Sometimes you just need to let your failure take a walk, and then it might lead you to success you never even dreamed of. Now, while our spring continues its journey through the corridors of time, let's take a look elsewhere, to where one person decided to create something eternal, using nothing but a pile of old mail and his infinite patience. Story number 27. The quietest and most devoted friend ever sold in a box. Imagine the year 1975. California, the town of Los Gatos. An evening in an ordinary bar. Friends are sitting, drinking beer, and, frankly, complaining. One is lamenting that his dog has once again eaten the carpet. Another thing is that the cat tore the curtains. The third is that fish are just boring, and you have to change the water in the aquarium every week. Among them sits Gary. He is 38 years old. He works in advertising and, to be honest, is tired of these conversations. And then it hits him. "Guys," says Gary, "I have the perfect pet. It doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't mess on the floor, it doesn't bark at night, and it will be loyal to you until the very end." "And who is this?" his friends ask. "A rock," Gary replies. Everyone laughed. "Good joke, Gary. Pour us another." But Gary Dahl was an advertiser. He knew that people don't buy things. They buy stories. They buy emotions. And he decided to take this absurd joke to the extreme. He didn't just go to the nearest construction site and gather up some stones. No, he went to the coast of Mexico and bought a batch of ordinary smooth gray pebbles, the size of a fist, which felt nice to the touch. But the genius was in the packaging. Imagine walking into a store and seeing an attractive cardboard box with handles. On it is written "Pet Rock." The box has real ventilation holes, so the rock doesn't suffocate, right? Inside, on a bed of soft wood shavings, lies your new best friend. But the real masterpiece was the instructions. It was a 30-page care and training manual. Gary Dahl wrote it himself, and it was a triumph of humor. It explained that rocks are very capable. They easily learned commands such as place, freeze, and lie down. The command fetch did require a little help from the owner. You just needed to throw the rock at a target. It even explained how to tell when your rock is happy and what to do if it seems too withdrawn. Listen, it was madness. Right before Christmas 1975, America went crazy. People were buying rocks for $4 each, even though the entire cost of the rock, box, and shavings was less than a cent. Gary sold 10,000 rocks a day. In 6 months, he sold over 5 million pets. It was the perfect gift. People bought it as a joke for their friends. They named their rocks, got them passports, took them on vacation, and even knitted tiny sweaters for them. It was mass psychotherapy. In a world full of stress and bad news, people just needed something to laugh about together. After 6 months, the trend faded. Well, like everything in this world. But by then, Gary Dahl had already become a multimillionaire. He proved that you could sell an ordinary rock if you packaged it with care and a good joke. The irony is that Gary later tried to replicate his success with other strange ideas, but the magic of the rock no longer worked. It was a flash, a moment when humanity decided that a gray pebble in a box was exactly what they were missing for complete happiness. To be honest, this is a story about how success isn't always about complex algorithms. Sometimes it's just about recognizing a smile in the most ordinary object. And honestly, when I see an old, smooth rock on some table, I can't help but check if there's a tiny box with air holes nearby. While our stone friends maintain their steadfast silence, let's travel to another place, where people decided to challenge not biology, but geography itself, creating something that should not have existed on the world map. This is story number 28. Wall coverings that didn't want to hang on walls, but taught the world how to relax. Imagine the year 1957. New Jersey. A quiet suburb, the smell of freshly cut grass, and 2 ambitious guys in a garage. Their names were Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavans. To be honest, they weren't aiming to save delicate packages. They wanted to revolutionize interior design. The guys thought that ordinary paper wallpaper was outdated, boring, and flat. They dreamed of something three-dimensional, something cosmic. Their idea was brilliantly simple. They took 2 plastic shower curtains and ran them through a special machine. The idea was to trap air bubbles between the layers. The result was something strange, a surface covered with even rows of transparent hemispheres. They glued it to the wall and paused. "Look, Mark," Alfred said. "This is wallpaper of the future. It's easy to clean, soft, and looks like something out of a science fiction movie." Well, this was an utter failure. It turned out that no one in their right mind wanted to decorate their living room with plastic bubbles. It looked cheap, odd, and, frankly, a little scary. People entered the room and didn't know whether to admire the walls or start popping them. But Alfred and Mark were stubborn. They didn't throw their idea away. They thought, all right, if this isn't wallpaper, maybe it's greenhouse insulation. Plastic with air retains heat excellently. They began offering their film to farmers, but silence greeted them again. Farmers preferred old-fashioned glass or regular film. That was strike number 2. 3 years passed. The company they started was on the verge of closing. Then, destiny knocked on their door. More specifically, a computer giant named IBM knocked on their door. Back then, computers were the size of rooms. They cost millions of dollars and were more fragile than butterfly wings, full of tubes, wires, and glass components. Everything broke at the first bump in the road. IBM was searching for a way to transport their computing machines so that they arrived intact. When the engineers saw Fielding and Siobhan's bubble wrap, they gasped. It was the perfect air cushion, lightweight, inexpensive, and incredibly reliable. Thus, the Silhouette Air brand was born. What was conceived as trendy wallpaper suddenly became the standard in global logistics. Sales skyrocketed. Fragile items around the world suddenly had their protection. But the most amusing part came later. Psychologists noticed a strange side effect. It turned out that people unwrapping packages didn't throw the wrap away immediately. They began to pop it. In fact, a whole study was conducted. It was discovered that the sound of a popping bubble and the sensation of resistance under fingers instantly reduce stress levels. This taps into our primal instinct. We need to twiddle something in our hands, to break something in a small, safe way. Today, bubble wrap is a business worth billions of dollars. There's even a day dedicated to appreciating bubble packaging. But it all started with 2 guys who simply wanted to make your walls soft and strange. This is a story about how, if your project didn't take off where you intended, it might just be waiting for its IBM moment, or for someone who had a really tough day and needed to pop a few bubbles. Now, while the world still has packaging material, let's explore another story. A place where one person decided to create something great using only salt water and his unyielding belief that the world is much larger than it seems at first glance. Story number 29. How tire salesmen taught the world about fine dining. Picture France in 1900. A beautiful era, but frankly, a nightmare for motorists. There were only about 3,000 cars in the entire country. Gasoline was sold in pharmacies in small bottles. Roads, by our standards, were only dirt, stones, and nails from horseshoes. In the city of Clermont-Ferrand, 2 brothers, André and Édouard Michelin, owned a tire factory. And they had a problem. Tires weren't selling. Why? Because people weren't going anywhere. Why buy a car if you can only drive to the local bakery? The Michelin brothers sat down and thought. They needed to inspire people to go on trips. But how? Listen, they came up with a brilliant move. They published a small booklet with a red cover for free. It didn't contain recipes for foie gras. Instead, it had lists of gas stations, tire change diagrams, addresses of public restrooms, and a list of decent places to eat and stay if you found yourself stuck in the middle of Provence. The logic was as simple as a brick. Look, there's a great inn 500 kilometers from Paris. Go there. The person drives, wears down the tires, buys new ones. Michelin profits. For 20 years, this guide was merely useful paper. Until one day, André Michelin walked into a workshop and saw his precious guide propping up a dirty workbench. Frankly, he was furious. He realized one simple truth. People don't value what they get for free. Starting in 1920, the guide became a paid publication and advertisements were removed. The brothers hired secret inspectors, people who would enter restaurants as ordinary customers, barely pay the bill, and secretly note everything from the quality of the sauce to the cleanliness of the forks. Thus, the legendary star rating system was born. 1 star meant a very good restaurant in its category. 2 stars meant it was worth making a small detour to visit. 3 stars meant this restaurant was worthy of a separate trip. Do you understand the irony? A company that sells tires is telling you, this soup is so good, you have to drive 1,000 kilometers and wear out your tires to try it. and the world believed it. Chefs began to go mad fighting for those stars. Restaurants closed if they lost even one. A small advertising brochure turned into the Bible of taste. Today, Michelin is a massive empire, but at its core, it remains the same. It's a way to entice us to leave our homes and seek out adventures, even if those adventures smell not only of bechamel sauce, but also of heated asphalt. This is a story about how the best way to sell a product is to sell the dream of a journey where that product will be needed. And honestly, the next time you see a sticker of the chubby little man on the door of a cafe, remember those two brothers from Clermont-Ferrand. They understood not only rubber, but also human curiosity. Now our route is nearing its end. There's one last stop left. This story is about how sometimes the greatest discovery is simply looking up when everyone else is looking down. Story number 30. How one guy decided that soda could earn him a fighter jet. Imagine the year 1996. America, the era of advertising wars between soda giants. A Pepsi commercial is playing on television with the slogan, "Show me this." The plot is simple. A guy collects points from bottle caps and buys various merchandise. A t-shirt is 75 points. A leather jacket is 1,450. Glasses are 175. And then comes the finale of the ad. The guy dramatically lands in a school parking lot on a real fighter jet, a Harrier. You know, the one that can take off vertically. A caption appears on the screen. The Harrier fighter for 7 million Pepsi points. And a voiceover adds, "Drink Pepsi, get more." Honestly, everyone laughed. A good joke. Flashy, cool, unrealistic. But 21-year-old student John Leonard was not laughing. He picked up a calculator. John was a clever guy. He understood that drinking 7 million cans of soda was technically impossible. Sugar would fill his ears long before he could even reach half of that. But he found a loophole in the promotion's rules. It stated that if you had at least 15 real points, you could simply buy the rest for 10 cents each. Listen, the math added up. To get a fighter jet worth $23 million, John only needed $700,000. Anyone else in his position would have sighed and gone for a cup of tea. But John found investors. He convinced 5 people that this was the deal of the century. So he sent an envelope to Pepsi's office. Inside were 15 points and a check for $700,850.45. Attached to the check was a note. "Please send me my fighter jet." At Pepsi, to be honest, they initially thought it was a joke. They sent John a reply. "Haha, great joke, kid. Here are some coupons for free soda. Relax." It was just a metaphor. But John Leonard was not going to relax. He filed a lawsuit. The great case of Leonard versus PepsiCo began. It was a nationwide spectacle. The company's lawyers worked hard to argue that any reasonable person would understand that a fighter jet in the ad was a fantasy, that you couldn't land a military vehicle in a schoolyard without permission from the authorities, that the points were just part of a game. And John stood firm. There was no disclaimer in the ad, no fine print. "You mentioned 7 million points, and I have points. Where is my jet?" Listen, the court case lasted 3 years. Judge Kimba Wood ultimately sided with the corporation. She ruled that the advertisement was too absurd to be considered a binding offer. John ended up without his fighter jet, but he did get his $7,000 back. But the funniest part is Pepsi's reaction. They didn't just remove the ad, they re-released it but changed the price. Now, underneath the fighter jets, there was the figure 700 million points, just in case any more students with calculators thought about storming their office. The irony is that John Leonard became a legend in marketing and law, and students still debate his case in universities. He proved that sometimes it's enough just to read the rules carefully to make an entire empire tremble. That was our negative story. Honestly, I feel a bit sad closing this volume of our archive. We journeyed through deserts and oceans, peeked into the bathrooms of inventors, and ventured into caves with hermits. We saw that the world is a place where anything is possible, if you have enough curiosity and a dash of madness. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoy stories in this format, Support this series with a like and let us know in the comments which city you watched us from. This will inspire us to open new archives. Who knows, perhaps behind the next door, something even more incredible awaits us. Until next time.